That envelope had been locked in a lawyer's safe for exactly 2 years, waiting, counting down the days until I turned 18. And what was inside would shatter everything I ever believed about my family, about my past, about the blood running through my veins. I still remember the taste of that final morning, instant oatmeal mixed with powdered milk. The same gray, flavorless paste I had eaten for 13 years at Pinewood Group Home, a squat brick building planted in the dry flatlands 40 miles east of Reno, Nevada. The kind of place that time forgot and the world never bothered to remember. But that Tuesday in March was different. I could feel it in my bones before I even opened my eyes. A heaviness in my chest. Electricity in the air. Something telling me that the girl who woke up in that narrow metal bed would not be the same girl who fell asleep that night. My name is Marlo Ashford. I was 18 years old that morning, and for my entire life I believed I had no one in this world except my brother. Beckett was 2 years younger than me, 16 years old with shaggy brown hair that never stayed flat. No matter how many times he ran his fingers through it, and sharp gray eyes that noticed everything, every lie, every half-truth, every unspoken word that hung in the air between people who thought they were hiding something. He had been at Pinewood with me since I was 5 years old, and he was barely 3. 2 children delivered to the front steps of a group home like packages that nobody wanted to sign for. Our parents died in a car accident on Highway 50 during a winter storm. That was the story they told us. A patch of black ice. A semi-truck jackknifing across the median. 2 people who had loved each other. Who had created us, who had dreamed of a future with their children. Gone in an instant of twisted metal and shattered glass. After that, we became wards of the state of Nevada. Bounced through 3 foster homes in 2 years before landing at Pinewood, where we finally stayed. Not because anyone chose us, not because we found a family, but because the system ran out of places to put us, and Pinewood was the last stop before children like us simply disappeared into the cracks. Beckett was the only family I had, the only person in the world who shared my blood, my memories, my last name. I would have done anything to protect him, anything to keep him safe in a world that had shown us nothing but indifference. And he knew it. He had always known it. That morning, I packed my small duffel bag with everything I owned. The entirety of 18 years of existence fit into a canvas bag the size of a pillow. 2 pairs of worn jeans with patches on the knees. 3 t-shirts, 2 gray and 1 faded blue. A dog-eared copy of a book about wild horses that a teacher had given me in 6th grade, the only gift I had ever received that felt like it was meant specifically for me. And $47 in crumpled bills and loose coins that I had saved over 2 years from my part-time job at the gas station on the edge of town. $47. That was supposed to be my fresh start, my ticket to a new life. Standing there in that cramped room with its water-stained ceiling and its walls painted the color of disappointment, I almost laughed at how pathetic it seemed. $47 to rebuild an entire existence from nothing. The knock came at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning. I knew it was Mr. Dunlap before I even opened the door. He had a particular way of knocking 3 soft raps, followed by a pause, like he was always giving you a moment to prepare yourself for whatever news he was about to deliver. He had run Pinewood for over 20 years. A tall man in his 60s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and hands that had signed the paperwork for hundreds of children like me. Children who arrive broken and left hoping. When I opened the door, his expression told me something was wrong. Or maybe not wrong. Maybe something I simply was not prepared for. "Marlowe," he said quietly, "there is someone here to see you." "A lawyer." I frowned. "A lawyer for what?" He shook his head slowly, and I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. Uncertainty. After 20 years of delivering bad news, of watching children age out of the system with nothing but the clothes on their backs, Mr. Dunlap had seen it all. But this was something different. "I think you need to hear this yourself," he said. I followed him down the long hallway with its scuffed linoleum floors and fluorescent lights that always buzzed faintly like insects trapped in amber. The smell of industrial cleaner mixed with the lingering scent of breakfast. These were the only constants I had known for most of my life. The hum of those lights, the chemical smell of that cleaner, the endless parade of footsteps echoing off walls that held no warmth. In Mr. Dunlap's office sat a man I had never seen before. He was maybe 58 years old, thin and slightly hunched, wearing a brown suit that looked like it had been purchased 20 years ago and carefully maintained ever since. His hair was gray and combed neatly to one side, and his face had the weathered look of someone who spent a lot of time driving long distances through empty landscapes. A worn leather briefcase sat on the floor beside his chair. The kind of briefcase that looked like it had carried important documents across state lines more times than anyone could count. "Miss Ashford," he said, standing up and extending his hand. His grip was firm but gentle, the handshake of a man who had delivered difficult news many times and had learned to do it with grace. "My name is Preston Kincaid. I am an attorney from a small town called Millbrook, about 4 hours east of here." I shook his hand carefully, studying his face for any sign of what was coming. Why would a lawyer want to see me? Preston Kincaid glanced at the group home director, then back at me. His eyes softened with something that looked almost like sympathy. Or maybe it was something deeper. Something that told me he understood more about my situation than a stranger should. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a large manila envelope, yellowed with age. The paper had the texture of something that had been stored carefully for a long time, protected from light and moisture, waiting for this exact moment. "I have been holding this for 2 years, he said, "per the instructions in my client's last will and testament. He specified that this envelope should only be delivered to you on your 18th birthday, not a day before, not an hour before. On this exact day, at this exact moment." My heart began beating faster. I could feel my pulse in my throat, in my temples, in my fingertips. The room seemed to tilt slightly, as if the floor had shifted beneath my feet. "Who was your client?" Preston Kincaid paused. The silence stretched between us like a wire pulled tight, vibrating with tension. And then he spoke the words that would change everything. "His name was Silas Ashford. He was your grandfather." The room went white. For a moment I could not see anything, could not hear anything, could not feel the chair beneath me or the floor beneath my feet. I was floating in a void of pure shock, my mind desperately trying to process information that contradicted everything I had believed for 18 years. "That is impossible," I whispered. My voice sounded like it belonged to someone else, someone far away. I do not have a grandfather. I do not have any family except my brother. I understand this must be a shock. Preston Kincaid set the envelope on the desk between us, and I stared at it like it might explode, like it might contain something that would destroy me or save me. I could not tell which. Silas tried for years to contact you and your brother. For 13 years, he fought to reach you. 13 years. The number hit me like a physical blow. 13 years was almost my entire life. 13 years was every Christmas morning I spent wondering why Santa never came. Every birthday I celebrated with nothing but a store-bought cake shared among 30 children. Every night I lay awake wondering if anyone in the world was thinking about me. The foster care system has strict regulations about outside contact. Preston continued gently. His letters were returned. His phone calls were blocked. He hired 3 different lawyers over the years trying to get custody or even visitation rights. Every single attempt failed. Why? My voice cracked on the word. Why would they block him? Preston Kincaid exchanged a glance with Mr. Dunlap, and I saw the group home director shift uncomfortably in his chair. The records show that your grandfather had some legal disputes years ago, Mr. Dunlap said quietly. Something about property rights and water access on his land. There were concerns about stability. The caseworkers decided it was better not to pursue placement. Stability. The word tasted like poison in my mouth. They had denied me a family because of paperwork, because of bureaucracy, because someone in an office somewhere had checked a box on a form and decided that my grandfather, a man who had spent 13 years fighting to reach me, was somehow unstable. I reached for the envelope. My fingers touched the old paper and I felt something shift inside me. Something breaking apart and reassembling itself into a new shape. Something that would never be the same again. Preston Kincaid spoke again, his voice soft. He passed away 2 years ago, peacefully in his sleep. He was 81 years old. But before he died, he made sure that everything he owned would go to you and your brother. And he made me promise, made me swear on everything I held sacred, that I would deliver this envelope personally on your 18th birthday. My hands were trembling as I opened the envelope. Inside were 3 items. The first was a folded map hand-drawn in faded ink on paper that had yellowed with age. Lines curved across the surface like rivers, marking roads and landmarks I did not recognize. A place called Shadow Ridge was circled multiple times, the ink pressed deep into the paper, as if the person drawing it wanted to make absolutely certain the location would not be missed. The second item was a key. Heavy iron, almost black with age, cold against my palm. It was larger than any key I had ever seen, with teeth that looked like they could unlock something ancient and important. Something that had been waiting a very long time to be opened. The third item was a letter, written in shaky handwriting on lined notebook paper. The kind of paper you might find in any drugstore in America. Simple, ordinary. But the words on that paper were anything but ordinary. I unfolded the letter slowly, afraid that moving too fast might somehow make the words disappear. My dearest Marlowe, it began. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have finally turned 18. I have waited so long for this day. I have dreamed of it every night for 13 years, imagining the moment when you would hold this letter in your hands and finally know the truth. I have written you hundreds of letters over the years, though I know you never received them. I have dreamed of your face, though I have only seen photographs. I have imagined your voice, your laugh, the sound of your footsteps in the halls of my home. I have loved you from the moment your father told me you were coming into this world, and that love has never wavered, not for a single day, not for a single hour. The house in Shadow Ridge Mountain now belongs to you. It has been in our family for 4 generations. Your great-great-grandfather built it with his own hands, cutting stone from the mountain itself. Your father grew up there, running through the halls, playing in the valleys below. And I have kept it waiting for you all these years, maintaining it, protecting it, preparing it for the day when you would finally come home. Go there, Marlowe. Find what I have left for you, and know that you were loved. You were always loved even when you didn't know I existed. Your grandfather, Silas Ashford. A tear splashed onto the paper. I had not even realized I was crying. The drops fell onto the ink, blurring the words, and I quickly wiped my eyes, desperate not to damage this letter. This proof that somewhere in the world someone had loved me. Preston Kincaid spoke again, giving me a moment to collect myself. The property is located in Sagebrush Valley, about 4 hours northeast of here. It is remote, Miss Ashford. Very remote. The nearest town is Millbrook, population 2,400. But the land is yours now, free and clear. No mortgage, no liens, just the property and whatever is on it. How much land? 63 acres, plus the house and some outbuildings. He paused as if considering how much more to tell me. There is also a bank account with a small amount of money, about $8,000. Silas wanted to leave you more, but his medical bills in the final years took most of what he had saved over a lifetime. $8,000, a house, 63 acres of land. A grandfather I never knew existed. The world had changed completely in the span of 5 minutes. Everything I thought I knew about myself, about my family, about my place in this world, had been rewritten in the time it took to read a single letter. That night I packed my duffel bag again, but this time it was different. This time I had a destination. This time I was not running away from something, I was running toward something. Toward answers. Toward family. Toward a home I had never known existed, but had been waiting for me my entire life. I waited until after midnight, when the hallways of Pinewood were dark and quiet. The younger children were asleep in their beds, dreaming whatever dreams abandoned children dream. The staff had retreated to their offices, filling out paperwork, counting down the hours until their shifts ended. Nobody noticed one more shadow moving through the darkness. I slipped out through the side door by the kitchen, the one with the broken alarm that nobody ever bothered to fix. The night air was cold and dry, filled with the smell of sagebrush and dust. The Nevada desert stretched out around me, vast and empty and indifferent to the small human dramas playing out beneath its stars. I had walked maybe 20 feet when a voice came from the shadows. "You were not planning to leave without me, were you?" I spun around, my heart slamming against my ribs. Beckett stepped out from behind the old maintenance shed, a backpack slung over his shoulder. He was grinning, but his eyes were serious. He had known. Of course he had known. Beckett always knew. "You cannot come with me." I kept my voice low, barely above a whisper. You still have 2 more years here. You are only 16. 2 more years alone, he said, walking toward me. 2 more years without you. Without anyone who actually cares whether I live or die. No way, Marlowe. You are the only family I have. I'm not letting you walk out of my life. I will come back, I promised. I will figure out a way to get custody when you turn 18. I will get a job, save money. Hire a lawyer if I have to. Beckett shook his head firmly. I am not waiting 2 years in this place by myself. I have already made up my mind. I am coming with you. If they catch you, they will put you in juvenile detention for running away. You know that. You know what happens to runaways. Then they better not catch me. He adjusted his backpack straps, and I could see the determination in his jaw, the stubbornness I knew so well. Come on. The Greyhound station is 3 miles east. I already checked the schedule. There is a bus at 4:30 in the morning that goes through Millbrook. I stared at my little brother. Except he was not so little anymore. He was almost as tall as me now. His shoulders broadening, his voice deepening. And there was a stubbornness in his face that I recognized instantly. It was the same stubbornness I saw in the mirror every morning. The same refusal to accept defeat, to surrender to circumstances, to let the world win. I knew I should argue more. I knew I should make him go back, force him to stay safe, protect him the way I had always protected him. But the truth was, I did not want to do this alone. The thought of walking into an unknown future, facing whatever waited for me in that house in the mountains without Beckett beside me, was more terrifying than any punishment the system could hand down. Fine, I said finally. But if anything goes wrong, you do exactly what I say. No arguments, no heroics. You follow my lead. Deal. His grin widened, and for a moment he looked like the little boy I remembered from our earliest years at Pinewood. Before he learned to hide his smiles. Before the world taught him that hope was dangerous. We walked through the darkness together, following the empty highway toward the bus station. The asphalt was cold beneath our feet, the white lines glowing faintly in the starlight. Above us, the Nevada sky stretched endlessly, filled with more stars than I had ever seen in my life. The Milky Way cut across the blackness like a river of light, millions of points of brightness that had been burning for billions of years, indifferent to the small dramas of human existence. Somewhere out there, past those mountains on the horizon, was a house I had never seen, a grandfather I had never known, a family history that had been hidden from me for 18 years. And I was finally going to find it. The Greyhound bus pulled into Millbrook just after noon. 4 hours of watching the landscape change through a dirty window. The flat sagebrush plains gave way to rolling hills, then to rocky ridges, then to mountains that rose against the sky like the bones of ancient giants. The town was smaller than I had expected. One main street lined with old brick buildings, most of them dating back to the late 1800s. A feed store with faded signs in the windows advertising products I had never heard of. A diner with a hand-painted name above the door, the letters chipped and weathered by decades of sun and wind. A hardware store that looked like it had not changed since the Eisenhower administration. Population 2,400 according to the sign at the edge of town. 2,400 people in a valley surrounded by mountains, living their lives far from cities, far from highways, far from the world I had known. Beckett and I stepped off the bus, with our bags squinting in the bright midday sun. The air was different here, drier, sharper, thinner. It smelled like dust and sage and pine and something else I could not identify. Something ancient, something that had been here long before humans arrived and would be here long after we were gone. Now what, Beckett asked, looking around at the empty street. The quiet buildings, the complete absence of anything resembling modern life. I pulled out the hand-drawn map from the envelope. The lines curved across the paper, marking a winding road that led east from Millbrook up into the mountains. A place called Shadow Ridge was circled in faded ink, the same desperate circles I had noticed before. The map shows the house is about 15 miles east of here, I said, up in the mountains, somewhere on Shadow Ridge. 15 miles. Beckett groaned. Please tell me there is a taxi service in this town. I looked around at the quiet main street. An old pickup truck drove past, slowly, the driver tipping his hat as he passed. An elderly woman walked her small dog on the sidewalk, stopping to examine the flowers in a window box. Nothing moved quickly here. Nothing seemed urgent. Time itself had slowed down, as if the mountains had cast a spell over the valley. I do not think so, I admitted. But we can ask. We walked toward the feed store, figuring someone there might know how to get to Shadow Ridge. A bell jingled above the door as we stepped inside, announcing our arrival to whoever was listening. The place smelled like grain and leather and old wood, the kind of smell that sinks into your clothes and stays with you for hours. Bags of animal feed were stacked along the walls, 50-pound sacks of grain and corn, and supplements for horses and cattle. Saddles and bridles hung from wooden pegs, their leather polished smooth by years of use. Tools lined the shelves, shovels and picks and post-hole diggers that looked like they had been made to last generations. Behind the counter stood a man in his late 40s wearing a flannel shirt and a baseball cap with a tractor logo. His face was weathered by sun and wind, his hands rough and calloused from a lifetime of physical work. When he looked up at us, his eyes narrowed slightly, studying our city clothes, our backpacks, our obvious status as outsiders. "Help you folks?" he asked, his voice carrying the slow drawl of someone who had never lived more than 50 miles from where he was born. "We're looking for a place called Shadow Ridge," I said, "up in the mountains east of here." The effect was immediate. The man's expression changed, his eyes sharpening with sudden interest. He set down the clipboard he had been holding and studied my face more carefully, as if looking for something he expected to find. "Shadow Ridge," he repeated slowly. "That is Ashford land. Nobody has been up there in 2 years. Not since old Silas passed." My heart skipped a beat. Silas was my grandfather. The man stared at me for a long moment. Something shifted in his face. Surprise, recognition, and something else. Something that might have been respect or maybe hope. "Well, I will be damned," he said quietly. "You are Henry's girl, Silas's granddaughter." Henry. The name hit me like a cold wave. "Who is Henry?" "Your father." "Henry Ashford." The man's voice softened. "He grew up in this valley, married a woman named Sarah, moved out to Reno for work back in the early 2000s. He shook his head slowly. His eyes filled with an old sadness. "We all heard about the accident. terrible thing. Just terrible. My voice abandoned me. All those years of silence, all those years of believing I had no past, no family, no connection to anything larger than myself. And here was a stranger who knew my father's name, who knew my mother's name, who knew things about my family that I had never been told. "I am Gus Whitfield," the man said, extending his hand. "I have owned this store for 22 years. Your grandfather used to come in here every week for supplies, every single week without fail, winter and summer, rain or shine." He paused, and I saw his eyes grow distant, remembering. "He talked about you kids all the time, showed me the letters he wrote, hundreds of them over the years. He would sit right there in that chair by the window and read them out loud before he mailed them. None of them ever got through. None of them ever reached you. And every time they came back stamped return to sender, it broke his heart a little more." Gus Whitfield's voice thickened. But he never stopped trying, never stopped writing, never stopped believing that someday you would find your way home. Even at the end, when he was too weak to hold a pen, he kept believing. He kept hoping. The weight of those words pressed against my chest like a physical force. All those years I had felt forgotten, unwanted, abandoned by the universe. And all along someone had been fighting for me. Someone had been waiting for me. Someone had loved me. Beckett stepped forward. "Can you tell us how to get to the house?" Gus nodded slowly. "I can do better than that. My nephew Pete has a truck. I will have him drive you up there. That road is rough, not made for walking, especially not with bags on your shoulders." An hour later, we were bouncing along a dirt road in the bed of an old Ford pickup. The truck climbed higher into the mountains, the engine groaning against the grade, the suspension jolting over rocks and ruts that had been worn into the road over decades of use. Our bags were pressed against our chests as we held onto the sides of the truck bed. The landscape changed as we rose. The flat sagebrush plains disappeared below us, replaced by rocky hillsides, dotted with juniper trees and pinyon pines. The air grew cooler with each mile of elevation. The sky seemed closer. The blue deeper, the clouds more defined against the vast dome of atmosphere. Pete, the nephew, was a quiet young man in his 20s with the same weathered look as his uncle. He did not say much, but occasionally he would point towards some feature of the landscape. "That ridge there, that is where the mountain lions den. Down in that valley, that is where the wild horses run in spring." And then he pointed towards something else. A dark mass of rock rising against the sky, its surface scarred by centuries of weather, its silhouette unmistakable against the afternoon light. "That is Shadow Ridge," he said. "The house is built right into the mountain. You will see it when we get closer. Built into the mountain." I thought about those words, thought about the map, the way the lines curved around the terrain. Thought about my grandfather spending decades in a place carved from living stone. 20 minutes later, Pete stopped the truck at the end of the road. The dirt track simply ended, giving way to a narrow footpath that wound up the rocky slope towards something I could barely make out in the distance. A dark shape against darker stone. A hint of structure where there should only be wilderness. "This is as far as I can drive," Pete said. "The rest you will have to walk, maybe half a mile up that trail." He looked at me with an expression I could not read. "Good luck up there, and welcome home." We climbed out of the truck bed, grabbing our bags. I thanked Pete and he nodded, giving me one last long look before backing the truck down the dirt road and disappearing around a bend. Then we were alone. The silence up here was unlike anything I had ever experienced. No traffic noise, no voices, no humming of electrical lines or rumbling of distant machinery. Just the wind moving through the rocks and the occasional call of a bird somewhere in the distance. It was the silence of a place that had existed for millions of years before humans arrived, and would exist for millions more after we were gone. We started walking up the trail. The path was steep and rocky, weaving between boulders and scraggly bushes that clung to the thin soil. My legs burned after 10 minutes. My lungs ached from the altitude fighting for oxygen in the thin mountain air. But I kept climbing, driven by something stronger than physical discomfort. Beckett, who was in better shape than me, pushed ahead eagerly. His long legs carried him up the slope with the energy of youth. The same energy I remembered from our childhood, when he would race ahead of me down the halls of Pinewood, laughing over his shoulder. "Marlowe," he called back, his voice sharp with excitement. "I think I see something." I climbed faster, my heart pounding. And then I saw it too. At first, it looked like part of the mountain itself. A wall of reddish-brown stone rising from the slope, indistinguishable from the natural rock formations that surrounded it. But as I got closer, I realized there was something different about it. Something deliberate. Something built. A wooden door, weathered gray by decades of sun and wind, but solid, substantial, clearly crafted by human hands. 2 square windows sat on either side of the door, their glass dusty but intact, reflecting the afternoon light, like eyes watching our approach. A small porch made of wooden planks extended from the entrance, the boards worn smooth by generations of footsteps, and the rest of the house simply disappeared into the mountain behind it, like it had been swallowed by the stone, like the rock had opened up and welcomed the structure into its heart. I stood there staring at this impossible house, this hidden place, this legacy I never knew existed. 4 generations of my family had lived here, had been born here, had died here, had loved and fought and dreamed within these walls of wood and stone. I pulled the iron key from my pocket. It was cold and heavy in my palm, the metal black with age. The lock on the door was old, but solid, the kind of lock that was built to last centuries. When I pushed the key inside, it turned with a loud click that echoed off the rocks around us. The sound bounced between the boulders, announcing our arrival to the mountain itself. The door swung open slowly, hinges groaning with disuse. Dust floated through the air, caught in the afternoon light that slipped inside. Motes danced in the golden beams like spirits welcoming us home. The first room was simple but substantial. A wooden table with 2 chairs, the wood worn smooth by years of use. A narrow bed pushed against one wall, covered with a faded quilt in a pattern of blue and green squares. Shelves lined with books, hundreds of them, their spines cracked with age, their pages yellowed by time. A small kitchen area with a cast-iron stove and a hand pump for water. Everything was covered in dust. 2 years of silence and stillness of waiting for someone who never came. But nothing was broken. Nothing was destroyed. It felt like someone had stepped out for an afternoon walk and simply never returned. But what caught my attention immediately was not the furniture or the books or the simple domestic details of a life long ended. It was the walls. Photographs, dozens of photographs, pinned and taped and tacked to every available surface, covering the wooden planks and the stone in a collage of faces I recognized instantly. Me and Beckett. School photos from every year, the kind taken against a backdrop of fake clouds. Birthday photos from group home celebrations showing us blowing out candles on store-bought cakes. Pictures that must have been taken by social workers over the years for our files documenting our growth and development. Somehow, my grandfather had gotten copies of all of them. Somehow, he had collected them from wherever they were hidden in the bureaucratic machinery of the foster care system. And he had hung them here, surrounding himself with images of grandchildren he had never been allowed to meet. Beckett walked to the wall slowly, his face pale in the dim light. He reached out and touched a photograph of himself at age 7, gap-toothed and grinning at something off camera. "He knew what we looked like," Beckett whispered. His voice was thick with emotion. All this time, he watched us grow up from hundreds of miles away. I stood beside my brother, both of us staring at faces we barely recognized as our own. Younger versions of ourselves frozen in time on the walls of a house we had never known existed. 13 years of photographs. 13 years of love that never reached us. In the corner of the room, I noticed something else. A rocking chair positioned to face the wall of photographs. The seat cushion was worn thin, the fabric faded to an almost colorless gray. The armrests were smooth polished by thousands of hours of hands resting upon them. He sat there, I said quietly. He sat in that chair and looked at pictures of us. Every day, every night. For years. My grandfather had spent his final years in that chair, staring at photographs of grandchildren he could not reach, waiting for a reunion that would never come in his lifetime, hoping against hope that someday we would find this place, would see these walls, would understand how much we had been loved. But there was more to this house than this single room. A narrow hallway extended deeper into the mountain, carved directly through the stone. The walls were rough rock, the floor smooth with centuries of footsteps, and the darkness beyond was complete. I grabbed an old lantern from a shelf near the kitchen, found matches in a drawer and lit it. The warm glow pushed back the shadows, revealing the corridor that stretched ahead. "Come on," I said to Beckett. "Let us see what else is back there." We walked down the hallway together. The air grew cooler as we moved deeper into the rock. The smell changed too, from the dusty scent of the front room to something earthier, more ancient, like the breath of the mountain itself. The lantern cast dancing shadows on the stone walls, our footsteps echoing in the enclosed space. I could feel the weight of the mountain above us, millions of tons of rock pressing down. And for a moment I felt a claustrophobic panic rising in my chest. Then Beckett grabbed my arm. "Do you see that?" I held the lantern higher. Metal pipes ran along the walls, silver lines stretching into the darkness ahead. Some disappeared into the ceiling. Others plunged down into the floor. They were large, substantial, clearly part of some kind of system that extended far beyond what we could see. "What are they?" I murmured. Beckett ran his fingers along one of the pipes, studying the construction with the focused intensity I knew so well. This was Beckett in his element. Even at the group home, he had been the one who fixed the broken radiators, rewired the faulty light switches, figured out why the ancient washing machine kept flooding. Machines made sense to him in a way that people rarely did. They are old, he said, really old. But look at them. They are not rusted. Someone maintained these for decades. Someone kept them working. We kept walking. The hallway opened into a larger space, and the moment I stepped inside, I stopped breathing. The room was enormous, bigger than the dining hall at Pinewood, bigger than any single room I had ever been inside. And it was filled with machines. Huge metal tanks stood along the curved walls, their surfaces gleaming faintly in the lantern light. Thick pipes connected them in intricate patterns, some as wide as my arm, others thin as my finger, all of them leading somewhere, carrying something. Old gauges and levers and dials covered a massive control panel in the center of the room, a semicircle of switches and screens that looked like something from an old science fiction movie. Dust covered everything, but beneath the dust I could see that these machines were serious, industrial, powerful, built to last generations and perform functions I could not begin to understand. Beckett let out a low whistle. What is this place? I walked slowly toward the control panel, my feet moving almost without my permission. My hand reached out and I wiped dust from one of the metal plates. Letters appeared underneath, engraved in the steel. Sagebrush Valley Water Control System. I read the words 3 times, making sure I understood. Water control, Beckett said, reading over my shoulder. His voice was hushed with awe. For the whole valley. Before I could respond, something happened. One of the machines made a low humming sound, then another. The pipes in the walls began to vibrate gently, a soft tremor I could feel through my feet. A screen on the control panel flickered to life, its glow weak and greenish, the kind of light you might see from an old computer that had not been turned on in years. Letters appeared one at a time, scrolling across the display. System detecting new keeper. My heart slammed against my ribs. Keeper. The same word my grandfather had used in his letter. Another line of text scrolled across the screen. Identity verification in progress. The humming grew louder. Lights blinked across the control board, first randomly, then in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate. Something was powering up. Something was waking from years of sleep. Bloodline confirmed. Ashford. Keepers identified too. Welcome home. The machines settled into a steady rhythm. The pipes in the walls vibrated like the heartbeat of something enormous. Something alive. Something that had been waiting for us. Deep below us, far beneath the floor of this impossible room, I could hear water moving through ancient tunnels. The sound of a river flowing in the darkness, carrying life to an entire valley. Beckett and I looked at each other. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder. Both of us, he said quietly. It recognized both of us. I nodded slowly, unable to speak. Whatever this system was, whatever my grandfather had been protecting for 50 years, it was now ours. The house in the mountain was not just a house. It was something far bigger, something powerful, something that had been waiting for us all along. And as I stood there, in that ancient control room, listening to the pulse of water deep beneath the earth, I understood for the first time what it meant to inherit a legacy. Not money, not property, not even a house carved into a mountain, but responsibility, purpose, a reason for existing that was bigger than myself. My grandfather had spent 50 years protecting this place, maintaining these machines, keeping the water flowing to every farm and family in the valley below. And now, somehow, it was our turn. The morning after they opened the cabin, Marlene stood in the ruins of what had once been her grandfather's kitchen. Water damage had warped the floorboards into waves, and frost crept up the inside of broken windows. But the pantry remained intact. A small closet built into the back wall, its door hanging crooked on rusted hinges. Behind the pantry, Harold had written, "A panel that slides." Jessie held Colton on her hip, keeping him away from the unstable sections of floor. Edna waited near the front door, watching the road below for any sign of unwelcome visitors. After Prescott's appearance yesterday, none of them felt comfortable letting their guard down. Marlene stepped into the pantry, her boots crunching on broken glass and debris. The shelves were empty, whatever supplies her grandfather had stored here, long since taken by animals or rot. She ran her fingers along the back wall, feeling for seams for anything that might indicate a hidden mechanism. Nothing. She pressed harder, pushing against the wood. Still nothing. The key, Jessie said from behind her. Maybe there's a keyhole somewhere. Marlene pulled the key from her pocket, the one with the handwritten tag. She examined the back wall more carefully, brushing away cobwebs and grime. And there in the lower right corner, hidden behind a broken shelf bracket, she found it. A small brass plate with a keyhole painted over to match the surrounding wood. The key slid in smoothly, turned with a soft click. A section of the wall shifted inward, revealing a narrow door that swung open on silent hinges. The darkness beyond was absolute. Marlene retrieved the flashlight from her backpack, grateful she had thought to replace the batteries at the gas station that morning. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a space about 8 feet square. Unlike the rest of the house, this room had been sealed against the elements. No water damage, no animal intrusion, no decay. The air inside was stale but dry, perfectly preserved. She stepped through the door. The flashlight beam swept across shelves lining every wall, filled with boxes and folders and photograph albums. A small desk sat in the center of the room, its surface covered with papers weighted down by a glass paperweight in the shape of a mountain. And everywhere, photographs. Marlene picked up the nearest one, holding it in the flashlight beam. A group of men in work clothes stood before a mine entrance, their faces grimy with coal dust and exhaustion. They weren't posing. They were lined up, numbered placards hanging from their necks like prisoners. Armed guards stood at either end of the line. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in her grandfather's handwriting, Site 7, October 1944. 14 men. Only 3 returned. Jessie had followed her inside, leaving Colton with Edna in the outer room. She picked up another photograph, this one showing a woman and 2 small children standing outside a modest house. The woman's face was hollow with grief. The Hendricks family, the caption read. James Hendricks assigned to Site 3 in March 1944. Reported deceased from mining accident June 1944. Body never recovered. Wife told he volunteered for hazardous duty bonus. He didn't. There were dozens of photographs, hundreds, each one meticulously labeled with names, dates, and brief notes about what had happened to the people depicted. A catalog of loss, a record of crimes that had been buried for almost 8 decades. Mom. Jessie's voice was strange, tight with emotion. Look at this. She held out a folder, its cover stamped with the Piedmont Mining logo, a stylized mountain peak. Inside were internal memoranda, their language bureaucratic and chilling. Relabor acquisition, Cedar Ridge District. Per Directive 447-B, additional workers required for expansion of Site 7 operations. Local recruitment insufficient. Recommend identification of suitable candidates from transient populations. Recent arrivals, individuals with limited family connections. Disposal protocols for non-productive units remain in effect. Site supervisors reminded that documentation of natural attrition serves company interests and regulatory compliance. Non-productive units, disposal protocols, natural attrition. They were talking about people, Jessie said, her voice barely above a whisper. They were talking about killing people and making it look like accidents. Marlene's hands shook as she set down the folder. Her grandfather had spent years collecting this evidence, intercepting communications, copying documents, building a case against men who had committed atrocities in the shadow of war. And then he had been silenced, threatened into decades of quiet. But he had never destroyed what he found. He had preserved it hidden. It waited for someone who could finally bring it to light. There's more, Jessie said, pulling out another folder. This one was thicker, filled with handwritten ledgers and typed reports. Lists of names. Hundreds of names organized by site number and date of arrival. Some had dates of departure noted. Most did not. Marlene scanned the pages looking for anything familiar. And then she stopped. Her finger frozen on a single entry. Thomas Whitmore. Site 7. Arrived August 1945. Status deceased. Body interred on site per Protocol 12. Thomas Whitmore, Edna's father. The man who had supposedly abandoned his family to find work in the city. The man whose wife had spent decades waiting for him to come home. The man who had never left Cedar Ridge at all. He was here, Marlene said. Edna's father. He didn't abandon them. He was taken. She felt sick. 76 years. Edna had lived her entire life believing her father had chosen to leave. Her mother had died still waiting for a man who was already dead before the war even ended. We need to tell her, Jessie said. Marlene nodded slowly. But first we need to understand all of this. We need to know exactly what we're dealing with. They spent the rest of the morning cataloging what they found. Photographs of workers of mining sites of armed guards. Internal memoranda discussing recruitment targets and disposal protocols. Financial records showing payments to local officials who looked the other way. Shipping manifests for ore that had been extracted without permits and sold on black markets. And buried deep in one of the boxes, a personnel file that made Marlene's blood run cold. Ashford Harold J. Position Site Supervisor, Site 7. Dates of service March 1944 to September 1945. Notes reliable. Efficient. Promoted to Senior Overseer April 1944. Termination transferred to Signal Corps. Listening post per Directive 891-C. Reason refused participation in Protocol 12. Implementation. Potential security risk. Recommend monitoring. Marlene read the words 3 times, hoping they would change. They didn't. Her grandfather hadn't just witnessed the crimes. He had been part of them. Site supervisor. Senior overseer. He had worked for Piedmont. Mining had managed one of their labor sites, had been promoted for being reliable and efficient. Until he refused. Protocol 12 implementation. She had seen that phrase in other documents. It referred to the disposal of workers who could no longer produce, who might talk, who had become liabilities. Her grandfather had been ordered to participate in killing people, and he had refused. That refusal had cost him everything: his career, his freedom, his ability to speak the truth without endangering his family. But it hadn't cost him his conscience. He had spent the rest of his life gathering evidence against the people he had once worked for, waiting for the day when someone could finally use it. Mom. Jesse was watching her with worried eyes. "What is it?" Marlene handed her the personnel file silently. Jessie read it, her face cycling through emotions. Confusion, horror, understanding, and finally a complex expression that might have been forgiveness. "He worked for them," Jessie said slowly. But then he stopped. He turned against them. "Yes. That's why they threatened him. That's why he couldn't talk. Yes." Jessie looked around the small room at the mountains of evidence her great-grandfather had spent decades collecting. He spent the rest of his life trying to make up for it. Marlene nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. "He wasn't a hero," she said. "But he wasn't a monster either. He made wrong choices and then he tried to make right ones. And in the end, the right ones cost him everything." They brought the most important documents down to Edna's house that afternoon, leaving the bulk of the archive secured in the hidden room. Marlene had no idea what legal implications might arise from possessing government documents from 1944. But she knew enough to understand that the evidence needed to be protected. Edna was waiting for them in her kitchen, tea brewing on the stove. Colton happily occupied with a puzzle at the table. She took one look at Marlene's face and knew something had changed. "What did you find?" Marlene laid the photograph on the table, the one showing Thomas Whitmore's name in the ledger, the one confirming he had been taken to Site 7 in August 1945 and had died there. Died. Edna stared at it for a long moment without speaking. Her weathered hands trembled as she picked it up, holding it close to her face, as if her eyes couldn't quite process what they were seeing. "Daddy," she whispered. Her voice cracked on the word. "They told us he left. They told Mama he'd gone to find better work. She was 70 years old, and she sounded like a child." Marlene reached across the table and took Edna's hand. "I'm so sorry. All those years." Edna's tears fell onto the photograph, spotting the old paper. Mama waited for him. Every Sunday, she'd make his favorite dinner, just in case that was the day he came home. She died still waiting. "He didn't leave you," Marlene said firmly. "He didn't abandon his family. He was taken. He was a prisoner. And when he couldn't work anymore," she couldn't finish the sentence. "Didn't need to." Edna clutched the photograph to her chest, weeping openly. 76 years of pain, of wondering, of the secret shame that came from believing your father chose to walk away. All of it dissolved in the truth. When her tears finally subsided, Edna looked up at Marlene with red-rimmed eyes. that held something new. Determination. What else did you find? Marlene told her everything. The labor sites, the disposal protocols, the evidence of systematic murder disguised as mining accidents, and finally, reluctantly, the truth about her grandfather's involvement before his refusal and exile. Edna listened without interruption. When Marlene finished, the old woman sat in silence for a long moment. "Harold was a complicated man," she said finally. "I knew him for 50 years after all this. He was kind, generous. But there was always something haunted in his eyes, something he carried that he couldn't put down." She looked at Marlene. "Now I understand what it was. He tried to make amends." "Yes. And he preserved the truth for someone else to use when he couldn't." Edna straightened in her chair, her grief hardening into resolve. "That truth cost him his peace. It cost my family 76 years of not knowing. There are probably dozens of other families out there, maybe hundreds, who still don't know what happened to their fathers and brothers and kins. They deserve to know." Marlene nodded. "That's why I need to figure out what to do with all of this. Who to tell. How to make sure it actually leads to something." A knock at the door interrupted them. Edna frowned, glancing at the clock. She wasn't expecting anyone. She moved to the window, peering through the curtain at the front porch. "It's him," she said, her voice suddenly cold. "Prescott." Marlene's heart accelerated. She moved quickly, gathering the documents from the table and passing them to Jessie. "Take these upstairs. Stay with Colton." Jessie didn't argue. She scooped up the papers and disappeared up the stairs just as Edna opened the front door. Warren Prescott stood on the porch, his breath misting in the cold air. He had traded his expensive parka for a more casual jacket today, an obvious attempt to appear more approachable. It didn't work. "Miss Ashford," he said, nodding past Edna into the house. "Mrs. Whitmore. I hope I'm not interrupting." "You are," Edna said flatly. "But I suspect that won't stop you." Prescott's smile flickered, then recovered. "I heard you've been exploring your inheritance." He directed this at Marlene, who had remained seated at the kitchen table. "That old cabin on the ridge. Quite the historical curiosity. How did you hear that? Small town. People talk." He stepped inside without being invited, his eyes scanning the room with practiced efficiency. "I'm actually glad you've had a chance to see the property. Now you understand what you're dealing with. Condemned structures, environmental hazards, the kind of liability that keeps lawyers up at night." "We haven't found any environmental hazards," Marlene said carefully. "Just old equipment. Historical artifacts." "Historical artifacts." Prescott's tone made the words sound naive. "Miss Ashford, that listening post was a government facility. The kind of materials they used back then, the chemicals, the machinery, asbestos insulation, lead solder, mercury in the equipment. It's a toxic waste site waiting to be discovered." He spread his hands in a gesture of reasonableness. "Blackstone has environmental specialists who can handle that kind of cleanup. We'd take it off your hands, handle all the liability, and you'd walk away with a substantial payment." "What about the other materials?" Marlene asked. "Documents, records, the things my grandfather kept in that cabin." Prescott's eyes sharpened, though his expression remained pleasant. Old papers, I wouldn't know anything about that, though I imagine any government documents would be classified. Removing them could be a federal offense. The threat was clear beneath the smooth words. They're not government documents, Marlene said. They're private papers. My grandfather's personal records. I'm sure Blackstone has no interest in those. For a moment, something flickered across Prescott's face, something that looked very much like fear. But it vanished so quickly, Marlene might have imagined it. Of course not. He recovered smoothly. Just making sure you understand the complexity of what you've inherited. History has a way of becoming complicated when lawyers get involved. I appreciate your concern. Prescott studied her for a long moment, and Marlene felt the weight of his assessment. He was recalculating, she realized. His initial assumptions about her, the homeless single mother, the desperate woman who would jump at any offer, were shifting. Let me be direct, he said finally. Blackstone's initial offer was generous, more than generous. But I'm prepared to improve it significantly. She named a figure that made Marlene's breath catch. Double what he had mentioned before. That's a lot of money, she acknowledged, keeping her voice steady. But I've learned some things since we last spoke. Things that make me wonder why Blackstone is so eager to acquire this particular piece of land. Historical value, mining rights, standard business interests. Then you won't mind if I take some time to research those interests before making any decisions. Prescott's pleasant mask slipped just for an instant. Time is a factor here, Miss Ashford. Markets change. Offers expire. And he paused, his voice dropping slightly. Your situation is rather precarious, isn't it? No permanent address, no stable income. Children living in what any court would consider substandard conditions. Marlene felt ice form in her stomach. A concerned citizen might wonder if those children are safe. If Child Protective Services should be informed about their living situation. Prescott spread his hands again, the gesture of a reasonable man discussing reasonable concerns. I'm not saying I would make such a call, but small towns have lots of concerned citizens. People talk, as I mentioned. Edna stepped forward, her small frame rigid with fury. Get out of my house. Prescott raised an eyebrow. Mrs. Whitmore, I said, get out. Edna's voice shook with decades of suppressed anger. I know exactly what your company is. I know what Piedmont Mining did to this community during the war. I know what happened to men like my father. Something shifted in Prescott's expression. Your father, Thomas Whitmore. Site 7. August 1945. For the first time, Prescott looked genuinely unsettled. He recovered quickly, but Marlene had seen it. The flicker of recognition, the brief calculation of how much they knew. I don't know what fantasy you've constructed from old papers and grief, but Blackstone Mining has no connection to events that allegedly occurred 80 years ago. Any claims to the contrary would be met with aggressive legal response. Then I guess you have nothing to worry about, Marlene said. Since we haven't made any claims. Prescott straightened his jacket, composing himself. I came here in good faith to make a generous offer. If you'd prefer to play games with your children's welfare, that's your choice. But remember that I extended every courtesy. He moved toward the door, then paused. 48 hours, Miss Ashford. After that, my offer decreases significantly. And I can't guarantee that certain concerned citizens won't feel compelled to make phone calls about children living in unsuitable conditions. The door closed behind him with a soft click. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Jessie appeared at the top of the stairs, her face pale. "I recorded all of that," she said, holding up her phone. Every word. The next 2 days were a blur of activity. Marlene contacted 3 lawyers before finding one who would take her call. Vivian Caldwell operated out of a small office in the nearest city, an hour's drive down the mountain. She specialized in environmental law and civil rights cases, and according to online reviews, she had spent years battling mining companies over land rights and cleanup violations. She had also, Marlene discovered during their initial conversation, gone up against Blackstone before and lost. "They have deep pockets," Vivian said over the phone, "and deeper political connections. I had a solid case 3 years ago, contaminated water, affecting a dozen families downstream from one of their operations. They buried us in motions and depositions until my clients ran out of money to continue. I don't have any money," Marlene said, "but I might have something better." The drive to Vivian's office took them through winding mountain roads, past small towns that looked frozen in time, past abandoned mining operations that scarred the hillsides like old wounds. Jessie sat in the back of Edna's truck, Colton sleeping against her shoulder, watching the landscape pass. With thoughtful eyes, they had brought a sample of documents from the hidden room, not everything, just enough to establish what they had found and what it might mean. Vivian Caldwell was younger than Marlene had expected, mid-40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her office was cluttered with case files and law books, the walls covered with photographs of landscapes, pristine rivers and mountains before and after mining operations destroyed them. She listened without interruption as Marlene laid out the story. The sealed cabin, the hidden room, the evidence of systematic labor exploitation and murder during World War II, the connection between Piedmont mining and modern-day Blackstone, Prescott's threats. When Marlene finished, Vivian sat in silence for a long moment. "This is unprecedented," she said finally. "Historical evidence connecting a current corporation to crimes committed 80 years ago. Evidence preserved by someone who was both witness and initially participant." She looked up at Marlene. "Your grandfather's involvement complicates things. I know. It doesn't invalidate the evidence. If anything, it makes him a more credible source. He had direct knowledge. He knew the systems from the inside. But Blackstone's lawyers will use it to paint him as a disgruntled former employee with a grudge. They'll say he fabricated documents to settle old scores. He didn't fabricate anything." Jessie spoke up. "We found government documents, internal memoranda with Piedmont letterhead photographs, with dates and names. That's not something you can fake." Vivian smiled slightly. "No, it's not. And modern forensic analysis can verify the age and authenticity of documents." She pulled out a legal pad, began making notes. "Here's what we're looking at. The criminal statute of limitations for the original crimes has long expired. We can't prosecute anyone for murders committed in 1944. But there are other angles, such as civil liability for ongoing concealment. If Blackstone, as the successor company to Piedmont Mining, knowingly suppressed evidence of crimes and continued to profit from assets obtained through those crimes, there may be grounds for civil action." Vivian tapped her pen against the pad. "There's also the question of reparations. Families of victims might have claims against the company, especially if we can prove systematic suppression of information about their relatives' fates. There are more families, Marlene said. Edna's father was one victim, but the lists show hundreds of names. Some of those families might still be in the area, still wondering what happened. That's our strongest angle. Vivian's eyes were calculating now, seeing the shape of a case. Historical documentation plus living families seeking closure. That's the kind of narrative that generates media attention, political pressure. Blackstone can bury a lawsuit, but they can't bury a story that goes viral. There's something else. Marlene hesitated. Prescott threatened my children, implied he would call CPS if I didn't accept his offer. And someone tried to break into Edna's house the night after we opened the cabin. That changes things significantly. Vivian leaned forward. Document everything. Times, dates, exact words. If Blackstone is using intimidation tactics, that's evidence of consciousness of guilt. They know what's in those records and they're trying to suppress it. How do I protect my family while this plays out? For the first time, Vivian looked uncertain. That's the hard part. Blackstone has resources you don't. They can hire private investigators, put pressure on local officials, make your life difficult in ways that are hard to prove and hard to fight. She paused. But they're also scared. You can see it in how aggressive they're being. They thought they had buried this forever. Now you've dug it up, and they don't know how much you have or what you're planning to do with it. That uncertainty is your leverage. They left Vivian's office with a plan. She would begin researching legal strategies while Marlene worked on identifying other affected families. They would document everything, create multiple copies of critical evidence, and establish a timeline of Blackstone's intimidation tactics. Most importantly, they would not respond to Prescott's deadline. The drive back to Cedar Ridge felt longer than the morning journey. Snow had begun falling as they climbed into the mountain's fat flakes that accumulated quickly on the winding road. Edna drove carefully, her old truck's tires struggling for traction on the slippery surface. They didn't see the vehicle following them until they were almost home. It appeared in the rearview mirror as they made the final turn onto Ashford Ridge Road, headlights bright in the gathering dusk. A dark SUV, the same model Prescott drove, maintaining a steady distance behind them. "Mom," Jessie said quietly, her eyes on the side mirror. "I see it." Edna's hands tightened on the wheel. They passed the turnoff to her house without slowing. "Where are we going?" Colton asked sleepily from his car seat. "Just taking a different route, buddy." Marlene kept her voice calm, looking at the snow. The SUV followed. Edna took the next turn, heading toward the main part of town. The SUV matched the maneuver. She took another turn, then another, winding through Cedar Ridge's small downtown. The SUV stayed with them. "They want us to know they're there," Edna said grimly. "They're sending a message." She pulled into the parking lot of the Cedar Ridge General Store, the only business still open at this hour. The lot was well lit, visible from the main road, populated with a few other cars. Safety in public view. The SUV slowed as it passed its tinted windows, revealing nothing of the occupants. Then it continued down the street and disappeared around a corner. They waited 10 minutes before driving home, taking a different route, checking constantly for following vehicles. When they finally reached Edna's house, Marlene made everyone wait in the truck while she checked the property. The house looked undisturbed. No broken windows, no signs of entry. But on the front door, stuck beneath the knocker, was a business card. Warren Prescott's card. On the back, in neat handwriting, tick-tock. That night, none of them slept well. The next morning, Constance Pemberton was waiting for them at the Cedar Ridge Public Library. The head librarian was a formidable woman in her 60s, with steel gray hair and glasses that magnified her sharp eyes. She had known Harold Ashford for decades. She explained, had listened to his stories that everyone else dismissed as the ramblings of a disturbed veteran. He used to come in here researching, she said, leading them to a back room filled with local history archives, census records, property transfers, old newspaper clippings. He was looking for patterns, trying to find traces of the men who disappeared. Did he find anything? Pieces. Constance pulled out a folder thick with photocopies. He found death certificates for some of the men, all listed the same cause. Mining accidents at various sites throughout the county, all dated between 1943 and 1947, all signed by the same doctor. That's suspicious, Jesse said. More than suspicious. Constance spread the documents across a table. Dr. Edgar Simmons. He was the company physician for Piedmont Mining. He certified every death, authorized every burial. And after the war ended, he retired very comfortably to Florida. Bought a mansion. Never practiced medicine again. He was paid off. That was your grandfather's theory. Constance looked at Marlene with respect. He spent years building this case. But he never had enough evidence to prove it conclusively. Now you do. They spent hours in the library cross-referencing the documents from the hidden room with public records. Constance knew the archives intimately, could locate obscure files that would have taken Marlene weeks to find on her own. By afternoon, they had confirmed 17 families in Cedar Ridge alone who had lost relatives to mining accidents during the war years. 17 men whose deaths had been certified by Dr. Simmons. 17 families who had received identical form letters expressing regret for their loss. Some of these families are still around, Constance said. The children of those men, now in their 80s and 90s, but still alive, still wondering. Would they talk to us? I think they've been waiting for someone to ask. Over the following days, Marlene met with family after family. Eleanor Coggins, 87, whose father had supposedly died in a tunnel collapse. He was claustrophobic, she said, her voice trembling. Everyone knew he couldn't go underground. But they told us he'd volunteered for extra duty. Said he was a hero. We knew it was a lie, but what could we do? Who would believe us? Walter Franklin, 91, who had been 12 when his older brother vanished. They came to the house, he remembered. Men in suits. Told Mama that Robert had signed up for dangerous work, that he knew the risks. But Robert had a family, a baby on the way. He would never have risked that. Never. The Hendricks children, now elderly themselves, gathering in their late father's house to look at the photograph Marlene brought. Their mother in the doorway, hollow with grief, not knowing that her husband lay in an unmarked grave somewhere in the mountains behind her. Each story was unique. Each story was the same. Men taken from their families worked until they dropped buried in secret. Families left with nothing but lies and the endless ache of not knowing. Marlene listened to every story, recorded each one with Jesse's phone, promised each family that their pain would finally mean something. On the fourth day, Professor Gilbert Harding joined their cause. He was a retired history professor who now ran a blog documenting local history and modern corporate influence in the region. He had been suspicious of Blackstone's activities for years, had tried to investigate their land acquisition patterns without finding solid evidence of wrongdoing, until now. Summit Ridge isn't just buying land, he explained, spreading maps across his dining room table. They're buying silence. Every property purchase comes with non-disclosure agreements about anything historically sensitive found on the land. Like mass graves, Jesse asked. Gilbert's eyebrows shot up. Do you have evidence of that? My grandfather documented several disposal sites. They're marked on his maps. Places that don't appear on any official records. Gilbert studied the maps with growing dismay. This matches patterns I've been tracking for years. Geological anomalies that Blackstone seems particularly interested in acquiring. I thought they were after mineral deposits, but if they're actually trying to control access to burial sites. He looked up sharply. They've offered to buy your land, haven't they? With threats attached if you refuse. A concerned citizen might call CPS, Marlene quoted bitterly. Gilbert nodded grimly. There was a family 3 years ago, the Calhouns. They found old mining equipment on their property gear dating from the 1940s. Blackstone offered them triple market value. When they hesitated suddenly, there were anonymous calls to various authorities about code violations, unpaid taxes, building permit issues. What happened to them? They took the money. Gilbert's expression was grim. Moved away. Never spoke of it again. Marlene thought of Prescott's business card on the door. Tick-tock. 48 hours, she said. That was his deadline. How long ago? 3 days. Gilbert exchanged a glance with Constance, who had accompanied them to his house. Then, Blackstone is about to escalate. They don't make empty threats. If you haven't caved to pressure, they'll increase it. As if on cue, Marlene's phone buzzed with a text from Edna, who had stayed home with Colton. 2 men in a truck just drove by the house slowly. 3rd time in an hour. One of them took pictures. The escalation had begun. That evening, they held a council of war in Gilbert's living room. Marlene, Jesse, Edna, Constance, Gilbert. 5 people against a corporation with unlimited resources and no apparent conscience. We need help, Marlene said. Legal help, but also public attention. Blackstone keeps winning because they keep things quiet. If we can make this story public. I know a journalist, Gilbert offered. Investigative reporter with the state's largest newspaper. She's been trying to write about corporate malfeasance in the mining industry for years, but she's never had solid evidence. Would she be willing to look at what we have? If it's as explosive as you're describing, she'd kill for this story. They made copies of everything. Documents distributed to multiple locations. Gilbert's safe deposit box. Constance's locked cabinet at the library. Vivian's office in the city. USB drives mailed to trusted relatives in other states. If something happens to us, Marlene said, the evidence survives. It was paranoid. It was necessary. The break-in attempt came at 2 a.m. Marlene was sleeping fitfully on Edna's couch. Jesse and Colton upstairs in the spare room, when she heard glass breaking somewhere at the back of the house. She was on her feet immediately, heart pounding. The kitchen. Someone was coming through the kitchen window. She grabbed her phone, dialing 911 as she moved silently toward the stairs. She needed to get to her children. A flashlight beam swept through the kitchen. Footsteps trying to be quiet but audible in the silent house. 2 people, maybe 3. 911. "What's your emergency?" Break-in Marlene whispered. "Someone's in the house." She gave Edna's address, trying to keep her voice low enough that the intruders wouldn't hear. "Stay on the line," the dispatcher said. "Help is on the way." From upstairs, she heard Jessie's door open. Her daughter appeared at the top of the stairs. Colton in her arms, his small face confused with sleep. Marlene gestured urgently. "Get back. Hide." Jessie nodded understanding immediately. She retreated into the darkness of the hallway. The intruders had reached the living room. Marlene pressed herself against the wall, praying they couldn't see her in the shadows. "Check the kitchen," someone said. A man's voice, unfamiliar. "Papers, files, anything with writing on it. There are people upstairs." Another voice. "I saw lights." "Then move fast. We're not here to hurt anyone. Just find the documents." Marlene's phone was still connected to 911. She prayed the dispatcher was hearing everything. Then Edna's voice cut through the darkness, strong and clear and utterly unafraid. "I have a shotgun," she announced from her bedroom doorway at the top of the stairs. "And I am not afraid to use it on men who break into my home in the middle of the night. The sheriff's department is on their way. I suggest you leave." For a frozen moment, no one moved. Then the sound of rapid footsteps retreating. The back door slamming. An engine starting outside, tires spinning on gravel. By the time the sheriff's deputies arrived, the intruders were long gone. They found the broken window, muddy footprints tracking through the kitchen, and a single dropped item on the living room floor. A Blackstone mining business card. The sheriff, a weathered man in his 50s named Patterson, studied the card with a complicated expression. "You think Blackstone sent people to rob you? I think Blackstone sent people to steal evidence of crimes their predecessor company committed 80 years ago," Marlene said. She was still shaking, but her voice was steady. "And I think you should know that everything important was already moved to secure locations. They came for nothing." Sheriff Patterson looked at her for a long moment. "There's been talk in town," he said finally, "about your grandfather, about what he might have known. Did you know him?" Everyone knew Harold Ashford. The sheriff's voice was carefully neutral. "Good man. Troubled. He came to me once about 15 years ago. Said he had evidence of crimes. Said powerful people were involved. I told him to bring me something concrete and I'd investigate." "Did he?" Patterson shook his head slowly. "He said he couldn't. Said if he gave me what he had, people he loved would be hurt. I thought he was paranoid. Maybe he was just realistic." He handed the business card back to Marlene. "I can't prove Blackstone sent those men. This card doesn't prove anything except that someone who had their card dropped it. But I can tell you this." His voice dropped. "Be careful. Warren Prescott has friends in this department, in the county government, in the state capitol. Whatever you're planning, plan it carefully." After the deputies left, Marlene sat on Edna's porch watching the sun rise over the mountains. Her children were safe. The evidence was safe. But she knew with cold certainty that this was only the beginning. Prescott had shown his hand. Blackstone was willing to use intimidation threats, even breaking and entering to protect their secrets. They had powerful allies, endless resources, decades of practice at making problems disappear. And all Marlene had was the truth. She thought of her grandfather standing in that cabin in 1948, faced with an impossible choice: silence or destruction. He had chosen silence to protect his family. But he had also chosen to preserve the evidence to wait for someone who could finally speak. 80 years, 3 generations. And now the moment had come. Marlene pulled out her phone and called Vivian. File everything she said. I don't care about the deadline. I don't care about their threats. We're going to court. The next morning, she drove to the Cedar Ridge Gazette carrying a folder of documents and the determination of a woman who had lost everything and discovered she had nothing left to fear. It was time to tell the world what Blackstone had buried. The Cedar County Courthouse stood like a monument to another era. Its limestone facade weathered by a century of mountain winters. Ionic columns framed the entrance and worn marble steps led up to heavy oak doors that had witnessed generations of justice, both true and compromised. On this December morning, those steps were crowded with people. Marlene stood at the edge of the gathering watching the scene unfold with a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief. 6 weeks had passed since she had opened her grandfather's sealed cabin. 6 weeks of threats and break-ins and sleepless nights. 6 weeks of gathering evidence, finding witnesses, building a case that should have been impossible. And now, finally, the preliminary hearing. Television news vans lined the street. Their satellite dishes pointed toward the gray winter sky. Reporters clustered near the courthouse entrance. Cameras ready microphones extended toward anyone who might offer a quote. The story had broken 3 weeks ago, when Vivian's journalist contact published a feature in the state's largest newspaper. Since then, it had spread like wildfire, picked up by national outlets, discussed on cable news programs, shared across social media, until the name Blackstone Mining had become synonymous with corporate evil. But the cameras weren't pointed at Marlene. They were focused on the families. Eleanor Coggins stood near the bottom of the steps, her 87-year-old frame supported by a walker, her white hair covered by a black felt hat. She held a framed photograph of her father. The image yellowed with age, showing a young man in work clothes who had never come home from the mines. Beside her stood Walter Franklin, 91 years old, but standing straight and proud, refusing the wheelchair his family had urged him to use. He held his brother Robert's photograph, the only image that remained of a young man who had been erased from history. Dozens of others had gathered as well. Children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the men who had disappeared holding photographs and documents and the accumulated grief of 8 decades. Some had traveled from other states after seeing the news coverage. Others had lived in Cedar Ridge their entire lives waiting for this moment without knowing it would ever come. They had created an impromptu memorial on the courthouse lawn, a growing collection of photographs and flowers and handwritten notes. The missing, the forgotten, the murdered. Finally remembered. Jessie appeared at Marlene's side, her phone already recording the scene. Professor Harding says there might be more families inside already, she reported. People who didn't want to face the cameras but wanted to be here for the hearing. Marlene nodded, her eyes scanning the crowd. She spotted Edna near the memorial, placing her own photograph among the others. Thomas Whitmore, Site 7. Her father's face frozen in time, finally receiving the acknowledgement he had been denied for 76 years. Constance Pemberton stood nearby, organizing documents with the efficiency of a woman who had spent her career managing information. Professor Harding was giving an interview to a reporter, gesturing toward the memorial as he spoke about the importance of historical accountability. And there, on the opposite side of the courthouse steps, stood Warren Prescott. He was flanked by a team of attorneys in expensive suits, their briefcases bulging with motions and objections, and the accumulated weapons of corporate legal warfare. A public relations team hovered nearby, distributing glossy fact sheets that emphasized Blackstone Mining's commitment to community and environmental responsibility. Prescott himself stood apart from his team, his eyes scanning the crowd. When his gaze found Marlene, he held it for a long moment. She didn't look away. Miss Ashford, Vivian Caldwell, appeared beside her legal pad, in hand, reading glasses perched on her nose. "We should head inside. The hearing starts in 20 minutes. Is everyone ready?" "As ready as we'll ever be." Vivian's expression was focused but cautious. "Remember, this is just a preliminary hearing. We're asking the court to authorize a formal investigation, preserve evidence, and freeze Blackstone's activities near the affected sites. We're not putting anyone on trial today, but we're starting something." "Yes." Vivian smiled slightly. "We're definitely starting something." The courtroom was packed to capacity. Every seat in the gallery was filled with additional observers standing along the walls, despite the bailiff's best efforts to maintain order. The families of the victims occupied the front rows, a wall of grief and determination facing the judge's bench. Blackstone's legal team had commandeered the defendant's table, a small army of attorneys arranging documents and tablets and evidence binders with military precision. Warren Prescott sat in the front row behind them, his expression carefully neutral. His expensive suit, a sharp contrast to the working clothes worn by most of the gallery. Judge Eleanor Blackwood entered through the side door, and the room rose. She was a formidable woman in her 60s. Silver hair pulled back severely. Her reputation for fairness matched only by her reputation for intolerance of courtroom theatrics. She had presided over environmental cases before Vivian had explained. She knew how corporations operated. "Be seated." The hearing began with procedural matters, the dry language of legal process that masked the human tragedy underneath. Vivian presented the motion for investigation, outlining the evidence they had gathered. The pattern of crimes spanning 8 decades, the ongoing efforts by Blackstone to suppress the truth. Blackstone's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Bradford Whitmore, no relation to Edna's family, responded with practiced outrage. He dismissed the documents as unverified, possibly fabricated. He questioned the credibility of witnesses whose memories spanned decades. He invoked the statute of limitations. The passage of time, the impossibility of proving anything about events that had occurred before most people in the room were born. "Your Honor," he concluded, "this is nothing more than a publicity stunt orchestrated by desperate individuals seeking financial gain. My client has been tried and convicted in the media based on old papers and older grudges. We ask that this court dismiss this baseless motion and allow Blackstone Mining to continue its lawful operations." Judge Blackwood adjusted her glasses, studying both attorneys with equal skepticism. "Miss Caldwell," she said, Your motion relies heavily on documents allegedly discovered in a sealed cabin. Can you establish the authenticity of these materials? We can, Your Honor. Vivian rose, reaching for a file. We have obtained expert analysis from 3 independent archivists, each of whom has confirmed that the documents are consistent with their purported age and origin. The paper composition, the typewriter fonts, the ink formulation, all match materials used during the 1940s. Additionally, she continued producing another document. We have cross-referenced the names and dates in these records with publicly available sources, death certificates, census records, newspaper archives. The correlation is exact. These are not fabrications. Whitmore objected. Expert analysis commissioned by the petitioners themselves, hardly unbiased. Judge Blackwood silenced him with a look. Continue, Miss Caldwell. Perhaps more importantly, Your Honor, the circumstances of these documents' preservation argue strongly for their authenticity. They were sealed in 1948 and remained untouched until my client opened the cabin 6 weeks ago. No one has had access to modify or fabricate these materials. They are, in essence, a time capsule of evidence that the original perpetrators believed had been permanently buried. The judge nodded slowly. What about the living witnesses you mentioned in your motion? We have identified 17 families in this county alone who lost relatives to what were officially recorded as mining accidents during the 1940s. Vivian gestured toward the gallery. Many of their descendants are present today. Their testimonies establish a pattern of deception that aligns precisely with the documentary evidence. Whitmore was on his feet immediately. These are elderly individuals recounting childhood memories from 8 decades ago. Their testimony is inherently unreliable, colored by grief and the desire for explanation. Judge Blackwood leaned forward. Mr. Whitmore, are you suggesting that multiple families independently and over the course of 76 years all fabricated identical suspicions about the circumstances of their relatives' deaths? I'm suggesting that memory is fallible, Your Honor, and that the emotional appeal of conspiracy theories can. That's enough. The judge's voice cut through his words like a blade. I'm not interested in theories about theories. I want to hear from the witnesses themselves. She looked at Vivian. You may call your first witness. Vivian turned toward the gallery. The petitioners call Eleanor Coggins. The elderly woman made her way to the witness stand, with painful slowness, her walker scraping against the wooden floor. A court officer helped her into the chair, adjusting the microphone so she could speak without straining. She looked impossibly frail, her hands trembling on the armrests, her eyes magnified by thick glasses. But when she spoke, her voice was clear and strong. My father was Joseph Coggins, she began. He worked in the mines all his life. Hard work, dangerous work, but he was careful. Everyone said so. He planned to retire in '45 when the war ended. He had saved enough for a little house with a garden. Mama was gonna plant roses. She paused, her gaze drifting towards something only she could see. In March of that year, men came to our house. Men in suits, not miners. They told Mama that Daddy had volunteered for extra duty, a special project, higher pay. He'd be gone for a few weeks. The courtroom was silent, every eye fixed on the small figure in the witness chair. He never came back. Eleanor continued. In June, those same men returned. They said there had been an accident, a tunnel collapse. They said Daddy was a hero. They gave Mama some money and a letter from the company. She paused. They never gave us his body. She reached into her purse with trembling hands and extracted a yellow document. This is his death certificate. It says he died in a tunnel collapse at Site 3, signed by Dr. Edgar Simmons. She looked up at the judge. My father was claustrophobic, Your Honor. He couldn't go underground. Everyone in Cedar Ridge knew that. He worked surface operations his whole life. But his death certificate says he died underground. Whitmore started to rise, but Judge Blackwood waved him back. The official story never made sense, Eleanor continued. But what could we do? We were poor. The company was powerful. They told us to be grateful for the death benefit and move on. She straightened in her chair, decades of suppressed anger finally finding voice. I never believed he died the way they said. I've lived 87 years with that doubt. And now I know I was right. She pointed toward the evidence table where Vivian had arranged the documents from the cabin. There's his name, she said. Joseph Coggins, Site 3. Arrived March 1945. Status deceased. Body interred on site per Protocol 12. That's not a tunnel collapse, Your Honor. That's murder. And a cover-up. The testimony continued for hours. Walter Franklin described his brother Robert, newly married with a baby on the way, who would never have taken on dangerous work voluntarily. The Hendricks family recounted their grandmother's lifetime of unanswered questions about her husband's death. Family after family, story after story, a tapestry of grief woven over 7 decades, finally being given voice. By mid-afternoon, even Blackstone's attorneys had stopped objecting to every statement. The weight of accumulated testimony was undeniable. These were not opportunists seeking payouts. These were families whose lives had been shaped by loss and deception, who wanted nothing more than the truth they had been denied. Your Honor, Vivian said as the last family witness stepped down. We have one more witness to call. She paused. The petitioners call Marlene Ashford. Marlene rose from her seat, feeling the eyes of the courtroom on her. She made her way to the witness stand, taking the oath settling into the chair where so many others had sat before her that day. She told her story from the beginning. The homelessness, the chance encounter with Edna, the discovery of her inheritance, the sealed cabin and the hidden room and the evidence her grandfather had spent decades preserving. But Vivian's questions were leading somewhere specific. Miss Ashford, she said, during your review of the documents from your grandfather's collection, did you find anything that explained his personal involvement in these events? Marlene took a breath. Yes. Can you describe what you found? This was the moment she had dreaded. The moment when her grandfather's complicated history would be exposed to the world. She looked toward the gallery, finding Jessie's face in the crowd. Her daughter nodded slightly in encouragement. My grandfather, Harold Ashford, was employed by Piedmont Mining during the war, Marlene said. Her voice was steady, though her heart was racing. He served as a site supervisor at Site 7 from 1944 until 1945. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Whitmore sat forward, sensing an opening, according to personnel records I found. Marlene continued. He was considered reliable, efficient. He was promoted. She paused. Then, in late 1945, he was transferred to a military listening post. A demotion, essentially. exile. Do you know why he was transferred? Yes. Marlene's hands gripped the armrests. An internal memo explained that he refused to participate in Protocol 12 implementation. What was Protocol 12? From what I've found in the documents, it was the protocol for disposing of workers who could no longer produce. Workers who might talk. Workers who had become, as the memos put it, non-productive units. The courtroom was absolutely silent. My grandfather was ordered to participate in killing people, Marlene said quietly, and he refused. What happened after his refusal? He was transferred to the listening post, essentially put under surveillance. The cabin was sealed in 1948 officially for national security reasons. But according to documents, I found the real purpose was to bury the evidence my grandfather had been collecting against the company. He was threatened. If he spoke, his family would disappear the same way those workers had. Whitmore was on his feet. Your Honor, this is hearsay. The witness is speculating about events she didn't witness based on documents of questionable provenance. Judge Blackwood's eyes were fixed on Marlene. Miss Ashford, she said, are you telling this court that your grandfather was both a perpetrator and a witness to these crimes? Yes, Your Honor. Marlene met her gaze steadily. He made wrong choices. He was part of a system that exploited and killed vulnerable people. But when they ordered him to participate directly in murder, he refused. And he spent the rest of his life gathering evidence, preserving the truth, waiting for someone who could finally use it. She looked toward the Blackstone attorneys, toward Warren Prescott's carefully neutral face. My grandfather's hands weren't clean, she said. He carried that guilt for 76 years. But his testimony, his documents, his careful preservation of evidence, none of that becomes less true because he was once complicit. If anything, it becomes more credible. He knew the systems from the inside. He knew exactly what they were capable of. She turned back to the judge. He died 2 years ago, still waiting for justice. He never got to see this day, but he made sure the truth would survive him. She paused. That's what I found in that cabin, Your Honor. Not just evidence of crimes. Evidence of a man trying to make amends for the wrong choices he made decades ago. The courtroom remained silent. Even Whitmore seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Then Judge Blackwood spoke, her voice thoughtful. Miss Ashford, she said, your grandfather's complicated history actually speaks to the credibility of this evidence. A fabricator would not include documents that incriminated himself. She looked toward the Blackstone table. This witness is excused, but we have more to address. The afternoon session focused on Blackstone itself. Vivian presented evidence connecting the modern corporation to its predecessor through an unbroken chain of ownership. The same families, the Prescotts and the Holbrooks and the Cranes who had controlled Piedmont mining in the 1940s, now controlled Blackstone mining resources. The same pattern of land acquisition that had preceded the labor camps during the war was being repeated today, with Blackstone systematically purchasing properties that might contain evidence of historical crimes. And she presented something new, something that had arrived just days before the hearing. Your Honor. Vivian said we would like to call 3 additional witnesses. Former employees of Blackstone Mining who have come forward with information about current corporate practices. The first witness was Marcus Webb, a former records manager who had worked for Blackstone for 12 years before being laid off 6 months ago. It was policy, he explained, his voice quiet but clear. Every time we acquired a new property, there was a protocol. If any historical materials were found, especially anything related to mining operations before 1950, they were to be secured and forwarded to corporate legal. He paused. I was told they were being preserved for historical purposes. I didn't question it at first. What changed your mind? I saw a memo once. It was misfiled, ended up in my queue by accident. It referenced disposal of sensitive historical materials from recently acquired properties. He looked directly at the Blackstone attorneys. They weren't preserving anything. They were destroying it. The second witness was Janet Morrison, a former administrative assistant. I processed payments, she said. Regular payments to certain local officials. Property assessors, county clerks, building inspectors. The payments were listed as consulting fees in our records. She produced a document, but no consulting was ever done. Whitmore objected strenuously, claiming the documents were stolen. The testimony coerced the witnesses, disgruntled former employees seeking revenge. Judge Blackwood overruled him repeatedly. The third witness was a man named Thomas Crawford, who had worked as a survey technician for Blackstone for 15 years. I found things he said. On properties we surveyed, old equipment mostly. Mining gear from the 40s, but sometimes, he hesitated. Sometimes we found other things. In one of the old shafts we were mapping, we found what looked like human remains, bones, old fabric that might have been clothing. What happened when you reported this? We were told to seal the shaft and mark it as unstable. No further investigation. I was reminded that my employment contract included confidentiality provisions. He looked at the judge. I signed those provisions, Your Honor, but I never agreed to help cover up murder. By the time the witnesses finished, Warren Prescott's confident expression had cracked. He sat rigid in his chair. His attorneys gathered around him in urgent, whispered conference. Judge Blackwood called a brief recess. When court resumed, her decision came quickly. Based on the evidence and testimony presented today, she announced, I find sufficient cause to order a formal inquiry into historical operations conducted by Piedmont Mining and their connection to current practices at Blackstone Mining Resources. I am issuing a temporary freeze on all Blackstone activities near the Ashford property and any other sites identified in the historical documentation as potential locations of criminal activity. She continued, her voice firm. I am ordering the preservation of all corporate records relating to property acquisitions, historical mining operations, and any materials discovered on acquired properties. I am recommending that the State Attorney General consider the establishment of a reparations fund for affected families, pending full verification of the evidence presented here today. She looked directly at the Blackstone attorneys. I want to be clear, she said. The crimes described here occurred nearly 80 years ago. The criminal statute of limitations has long expired. But the ongoing concealment of those crimes, the destruction of evidence, the systematic suppression of the truth, these are not historical matters. These are present-day concerns, and they will be investigated fully. Her gaze moved to Marlene. I want to commend Miss Ashford for bringing this matter forward despite significant personal risk. The pursuit of truth, however delayed, serves the interests of justice. Outside the courthouse, chaos reigned. Reporters swarmed around Marlene Vivian. the family witnesses shouting questions that blurred together into unintelligible noise. Camera flashes exploded in rapid succession, microphones thrust toward faces capturing tears and triumph, and the complicated emotions of a moment 8 decades in the making. Marlene found herself at the center of the storm, Jessie gripping her hand on one side, Colton secure on her hip. Questions came from every direction. "Miss Ashford, how does it feel to finally have your grandfather's evidence validated? Will you seek civil damages against Blackstone? How many families do you believe were affected? What happens now?" The last question cut through the noise. Marlene looked at the reporter who had asked it, a young woman with intelligent eyes and a digital recorder. "What happens now?" Marlene repeated. She looked around at the families gathered on the courthouse steps, at the memorial still growing on the lawn, at the distant mountains where her grandfather's cabin stood sentinel over buried truths. Now we find all of them. Every family that lost someone, every person who disappeared into those camps and never came home. We find them and we tell their stories and we make sure they're never forgotten again. The reporter pressed on. "And Blackstone, do you expect them to face real consequences?" Marlene spotted Warren Prescott across the crowd, being hustled toward a waiting SUV by his attorneys. Their eyes met for a brief moment. His expression was no longer neutral. It was the face of a man watching his empire crumble. "I expect the truth to matter," she said. "That's all I ever wanted. The truth." The settlement negotiations began 3 weeks later. Blackstone's initial posture was defiant. Their attorneys filed appeals, sought to seal documents, attempted to move the investigation to federal jurisdiction where their connections ran deeper. But the public pressure was relentless. Every day brought new revelations as families across multiple states came forward with similar stories, similar suspicions, similar losses. Warren Prescott was quietly transferred to a division in another state, neither punished nor promoted, but removed from the equation. The Blackstone Board of Directors issued a carefully worded statement expressing concern about newly discovered historical matters while denying any institutional responsibility. But the evidence was overwhelming. And when 2 more former employees came forward with documentation of ongoing cover-up efforts, the corporation's legal strategy collapsed. The final settlement announced in late February exceeded even Vivian's optimistic projections. Blackstone would establish a reparations fund of significant value, administered by an independent commission, to compensate families of verified victims. They would fund a memorial and education center on the site of the old cabin, with community oversight to ensure the truth was presented honestly. They would transfer the mineral rights to all affected properties to a conservation trust, permanently preventing future exploitation. And perhaps most importantly, they would provide access to their corporate archives, allowing historians to document the full scope of what had occurred. "They're paying for their own redemption," Vivian observed during the final negotiation session. "It's not justice in the purest sense. The men who committed these crimes lived full lives and died peacefully. But it's acknowledgement. And for some wounds, acknowledgement is the beginning of healing." "The original perpetrators escaped accountability," Marlene said. "That bothers me." "It should." Vivian's voice was gentle but honest. "It should bother all of us. But consider what you've accomplished. 17 families in this county alone now know what happened to their loved ones. Hundreds more across the region are finally getting answers. A conspiracy of silence that lasted almost 80 years has been broken. She looked at Marlene with something approaching admiration. Your grandfather waited his whole life for someone to use what he preserved. You did that. You gave meaning to his sacrifice. That has to count for something. Spring came late to Cedar Ridge that year, snow lingering in the high elevations until early April. But when it finally arrived, it brought transformation. The main house on Ashford Ridge had been completely restored. New roof, new windows, new foundation where needed. The broken boards and sagging porch were gone, replaced by solid construction that would withstand another century of mountain winters. Fresh paint brightened the exterior, and curtains hung in windows that actually opened. It had become a real home. Marlene's home. Colton had claimed the smallest bedroom, the one with the window overlooking the valley, as his own. His stuffed rabbit, threadbare and missing one eye, sat on a real pillow for the first time in his short life. His breathing had improved steadily with proper medication and clean mountain air. The wheeze that had once marked every breath, now rare and manageable. Jessie had taken the larger room at the back of the house, its walls already covered with photographs and maps and printouts from her ongoing documentation project. Her temporary phone recordings had evolved into something larger, a comprehensive archive of testimonies from affected families across 4 states. A university had offered her a scholarship based on the work, a full ride to study journalism and documentary filmmaking. She had accepted, though she sometimes still seemed surprised that such opportunities existed for people like them. "Mom," she said one evening, finding Marlene on the restored front porch as sunset painted the mountains gold and rose. "Do you remember what you said outside the courthouse about the truth mattering?" Marlene nodded, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, watching the light change on the ridge. "I've been thinking about that." Jessie continued, "About what truth actually means." She sat down on the porch steps, her back against the railing. Great-Grandpa Harold was part of the system. He supervised one of those sites. He was there when people were worked to death. Yes. Marlene had stopped trying to simplify her grandfather's story. The truth was complicated, and her children deserved to understand complications, but he also preserved the evidence. He refused to kill people directly. He spent the rest of his life trying to make it right. Also, yes. Jessie was quiet for a moment. So which one was he, the overseer or the whistleblower? The criminal or the witness? He was both. Marlene set down her tea, turning to face her daughter fully. That's the hardest part of all this. People want simple stories. Heroes and villains. Good and evil. But most people aren't either. They're both at different times, sometimes at the same time. Like you, Jessie said quietly. You could have taken Blackstone's money, kept us safe, let the truth stay buried. I could have. But you didn't. No. Marlene smiled slightly. Though I'd be lying if I said I wasn't tempted. When Prescott named that first number, I thought about how many problems it would solve. A house, stability, your education, Colton's medical care, everything we'd been desperate for. What changed your mind? Marlene considered the question. Reading Grandpa Harold's letter, she said finally. He wrote that he thought silence was just another form of cowardice. that he spent 76 years wondering if protecting his family justified betraying all those other families. She paused. I realized that if I took Blackstone's money, I'd be making the same choice he made, choosing safety over truth. And I'd spend the rest of my life wondering the same thing he did. And now I know I made the right choice. Because look what's happened. The memorial, the reparations fund, the families who finally have answers. She gestured toward the ridge where the cabin's lights were visible in the gathering dusk. The education center that's going to teach people about what happened so it doesn't happen again. Jesse followed her gaze. Do you think he knows Great-Grandpa Harold? Do you think wherever he is, he knows it finally worked? Marlene considered this for a long moment. I don't know what happens after we die, she said, honestly. But I know he left us everything we needed. The evidence, the explanation, the key to the secret room. He prepared for decades just in case someone in his family would need it. She smiled. Whether he knows or not, his work mattered. That's a kind of immortality, isn't it? On the ridge, above them, the cabin had been transformed into something new. The sealed door was now a museum entrance, welcoming visitors who wanted to understand what had happened in these mountains during the war years. The interior had been carefully preserved. The old radio and maps and filing cabinets maintained exactly as Harold had left them, a time capsule that taught by existing. But the space around the cabin had changed dramatically. A small memorial garden now surrounded the building with stone markers bearing the names of every verified victim. Pathways wound through native plantings, leading visitors on a journey from the cabin to an overlook where they could see the valley. Below the town of Cedar Ridge, the mountains stretching to the horizon, and at the center of the garden, a larger monument had been erected. A granite obelisk inscribed with words that Marlene had written after weeks of deliberation. Here lie the forgotten, workers taken from their families, imprisoned in these mountains, worked until they could work no more, buried without ceremony or recognition. For nearly 80 years, their stories were silenced. Now their names are spoken. Now their sacrifices are honored. Now their truth is told. They are forgotten no more. Below the inscription, the names began. Hundreds of them carefully verified through years of research, carved into stone that would endure for generations. Edna Whitmore visited the memorial often. She came in the mornings before the visitors arrived when the garden was quiet and the mist still clung to the mountaintops. She would sit on a bench near the stone that bore her father's name, talking to him in low murmurs that no one else could hear. 76 years she had lived believing her father abandoned her. Now she could finally grieve him properly. I told Mama, she said during one of these visits, Marlene sitting quietly beside her. Last time I visited her grave, I told her the truth, that Daddy didn't leave us, that he was taken, that he died trying to survive, not running away from his family. She wiped her eyes with a handkerchief, the same gesture her mother must have made countless times over the decades. I know she can't hear me. Edna continued, but it felt important to say it, to close the circle somehow. Marlene took her hand. I'm sure it mattered. You know what I keep thinking about? Edna looked at the names carved into stone, row after row of them. All these families, all these years of not knowing. And now, because of what you did, they can finally rest. It wasn't just me. No, it wasn't. But you were the one who opened the door. You were the one who refused to be bought. Edna squeezed her hand. Harold chose the right person to leave his burden to. The Ashford Haven project broke ground in late spring. The buildings rose slowly on the lower slope of the ridge away from the historical sites, but close enough to be part of the property. Simple cabins, solidly built, designed for single mothers and their children who had nowhere else to go. Marlene had fought hard for this in the settlement negotiations. She knew what it meant to be homeless with children, to lie awake wondering where you would sleep the next night, to watch your children grow weary and old before their time. She had survived it. She wanted to make sure others had a better chance. From one family's tragedy to many families' second chance, she told the local newspaper when they came to cover the groundbreaking. That was always the plan. The program would offer more than just shelter. Caseworkers would help residents find jobs, access services, navigate the systems that had failed them, education support for children, counseling for trauma. A path forward that didn't require choosing between dignity and survival. The first residents arrived in August. A young woman named Jessica, fleeing an abusive relationship with her 7-year-old daughter. A grandmother raising 3 grandchildren after their parents' overdose deaths. A veteran with PTSD and her teenage son, both exhausted from years of couch surfing and shelter hopping. Marlene met each one personally, showed them their cabins, introduced them to the support staff, explained the programs available to them, and she told them briefly the story of how this place came to exist. A sealed cabin, a buried truth, a grandmother who refused to stay silent. Most of all, she told them they were not alone, that their struggles didn't define them, that there was always a path forward even when you couldn't see it, because she had lived it herself. 1 year to the day after she had opened her grandfather's sealed cabin, Marlene stood on the porch of her restored home, watching the sun set over the mountains. So much had changed. Colton ran across the yard with children from the haven, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. He was 4 now, healthy and strong. His asthma managed with proper medication. His cheeks rosy from mountain air and childhood joy. Jessie sat on the porch steps, her laptop open, editing footage for a documentary she was creating about the families affected by Piedmont mining. She had interviews with survivors across 4 states, archival footage, historical photographs. It would be her entry to the journalism school, a testament to what one determined teenager could accomplish with a phone and a purpose. Edna rocked in a chair nearby, a blanket across her lap, watching the children play. She had become family over the past year, moving into a small apartment in the Haven, where she could help with the younger residents while staying close to Marlene and the memorial to her father. The cabin on the ridge was visible from here, its windows glowing with interior light. Visitors were still inside the last tour group of the day, learning about what had happened in these mountains and why it mattered. The old radio had been fully restored by a local enthusiast. It played recordings of historical broadcasts for visitors, including the VE Day announcement that had crackled to life when Colton touched the dials that first day. The sound of history preserved and shared. "Mom," Jessie closed her laptop, looking up at Marlene. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't been homeless? If we'd never lost everything? Never ended up in that alley? Never met Edna by chance?" Marlene considered the question. Every day, she admitted, we probably never would have come here. Never would have found the cabin. never would have learned the truth. Probably not. Jesse was quiet for a moment. So, in a weird way, losing everything led to finding everything. Marlene smiled, sitting down beside her daughter on the steps. "I've thought about that a lot," she said. "About how the worst time in our lives led to this." She gestured at the haven at the memorial, visible on the ridge at the mountains stretching toward the horizon. "I wouldn't wish homelessness on anyone. It was terrifying and degrading, and I was scared every single day that I was going to lose you and Colton. But if I had to go through it to get here, to bring justice to all those families, to build something that will help other families survive, what we survived then, maybe it was worth it." Jessie leaned against her shoulder. "Great-Grandpa Harold's letter said he wrote it for when you had nothing left to lose." Marlene nodded. "He understood something important. When you've lost everything, you stop being afraid. You stop making safe choices because there are no safe choices left. You can finally tell the truth because the truth is all you have. That's kind of beautiful and kind of sad. It's both. Like most true things." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and deep blue. The children's laughter faded as parents called them in for dinner. Lights came on in the haven cabins, small warm glows scattered across the darkening slope. From the memorial on the ridge, a final group of visitors emerged, making their way down the path toward their cars. Marlene could hear their voices, quiet and thoughtful, the way people spoke when they had just learned something that changed their understanding of the world. That was Harold's legacy, she realized. Not the land or the documents or even the justice that had finally been served. His legacy was the changed understanding, the broken silence, the truth that could no longer be buried. She thought of him standing in that cabin in 1948, faced with an impossible choice: seal the evidence or lose his family. He had chosen protection, but he had also chosen preservation. He had carried the weight for 76 years, waiting for someone who could finally set it down. Now, it was set down. The burden was lifted. The truth was told. And from that truth, something new was growing. Healing for old wounds, shelter for new struggles, hope for families who had none. The lights in the cabin on the ridge finally went out as the staff closed up for the night. The memorial garden fell into darkness, the names on the stones invisible now but no less real. Tomorrow they would be illuminated again. Tomorrow more visitors would come, more stories would be told, more understanding would grow. But tonight Marlene sat on her porch with her daughter beside her, and her son playing in the yard, and her chosen family gathered close, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Peace. She had come here with nothing. Homeless, desperate, afraid. She had stumbled into an inheritance she never expected. Uncovered crimes she never imagined found strength she never knew she possessed. And now she was home. The mountains stood silent in the darkness, keeping their secrets no longer. The truth had been told. The forgotten had been remembered. The silence had been broken. Some truths take generations to emerge. Some justice takes decades to arrive. Some wrongs can never be fully righted, only acknowledged, only honored, only learned from. But every truth that is finally told matters. Every silence that is finally broken creates space for healing. Every person who finds the courage to speak makes it easier for the next person to do the same. Harold Ashford had waited 76 years for someone to open his sealed cabin. He had preserved the evidence, written the letter, carved the message in the door, all in hope that someday someone would come. Marlene had come, and because she had, the world had changed. Not entirely, not perfectly, but meaningfully. That was enough. It had to be. The stars emerged above the mountains, the same stars that had shone over these ridges for millennia, that had witnessed the crimes and the silence, and now witnessed the reckoning. They would keep shining long after everyone alive today was gone, long after the memorial stones had weathered, and the education center had crumbled, and even the mountains themselves had worn away. But somewhere in that vast sweep of time, this moment mattered. This truth mattered. These names mattered. The forgotten had been remembered. And that made all the difference.